Today's story is about a young man named Harvey, and whilst he was climbing the Kailash mountain, located in Tibet, when everything took a huge turn for the worse. Harvey lived in a small town located in southwest Texas. He had never ventured far from his town. Furthest he'd ever gone had been to the local shops. He worked in a warehouse, only a 2-minute walk around the corner of his house. Harvey had grown bored of his job after working tirelessly for half a decade. Harvey lived alone in a one-bedroom house, and after he had finished his shift one day, he had decided he had enough of his boring and repetitive lifestyle. So he decided it was time to make a change. Harvey sat down on his couch before grabbing his laptop and opening it up. He wanted different scenery and started exploring the internet to find somewhere to have an adventure and take a break from his mundane life. He had stumbled across the beautiful mountains of Kailash, located in the remote southwest corner of Tibet, in the Himalayan mountains. No one had ever successfully completed this summit, but Harvey had always dreamed of being the first person to complete a dangerous adventure like this. When he saw the opportunity, he knew it would be worth the time of taking on this dangerous climb. He started reminiscing on his childhood memories of when he used to climb trees and fell in love with the hobby of climbing again. Despite the minimal climbing experience, he thought he could still take on the daring challenge of Mount Kailash. Knowing that this had never been completed, he knew he would have to attempt this alone. But he simply didn't care, as he was confident in his ability to scale the 6,638-metre mountain. In all of Harvey's excitement, he rushed down to his workplace, the only time he had ever been happy to be there. He booked the time off work. Harvey rushed to the convenience store to get a suitcase, as he had never been travelling before. He also purchased some other essential items for this trip. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, he almost forgets to pay before being reminded by the store assistant. After hurrying home, he packs a week's worth of clothes and sprinted out the door to his truck and started up the engine to head to the airport. Worried about boarding the plane, as it was his first flight he had ever gone on, but without hesitation, he forced himself to board the plane. He went to his seat, and his head started rushing with bad scenarios about all the terrible stories he had heard on planes. The takeoff was smooth, before midway through the flight, where they began to experience mild turbulence. Harvey began to notice his stomach feeling unsettled before swiftly grabbing a paper bag and vomiting aggressively. He felt like the journey was never ending. After many hours passing, with the fear of the turbulence returning, he finally dozes off into his sleep. After the plane landed, Harvey felt a wave of relief fill his body before stepping off. Standing outside the airport, his taxi arrives, and he begins to load his luggage into the taxi before they set off to the hotel. Harvey walked up to the receptionist, booked in, and went upstairs to unpack his bags, feeling the same wave of excitement from the start of his journey. It was already late in the evening, so Harvey decided to go to bed ahead of his adventure in the early morning. After preparing for his trip by packing water, food, a compass, and a pair of hiking shoes, heading to the taxi, after getting in the car and talking to the driver, he gets warned about how this is a dangerous summit and how it had never been completed before, but that's what made it special to Harvey. The taxi driver dropped him 3 miles away from his destination, as it was unsafe to continue driving in the winter conditions of the Himalayas, as there could be a blizzard at any moment. The taxi driver, hoping he would turn back and not bother attempting the climb of the mountain. But you could tell that was unlikely, as Harvey was determined to complete his mission. He began to trek across the gravelly terrain towards the mountain. Along this path, only a mile away from his destination, he runs into a hiker from around the area and stops Harvey to ask where he's heading with all that equipment. Harvey points. After a moment of silence, the man replies, asking if he's aware that it's disrespectful to the 4 religions, and that no one is allowed to climb the Kailash mountain. After a long stare, Harvey sighed and walked on. The hiker disagreed with his actions, but wasn't going to fight over it. He reaches the bottom of the mountain looks at the top and begins his ascent. After an hour of walking, he decides to sit down and open his bag to grab something to eat. While doing so, he heard a faint sound in the distance like a screech, but he brushed it off as just the wind and just continues his trek, walking up the mountain to reach the peak. He arrives at a location to set up camp with a tent and a small fire to keep him warm. The temperature started to drop as he shivered, but he managed to sleep through the night. After a good night's rest, Harvey hastily set off that morning, eager to complete his journey. As he got higher into his descent, he felt the altitude beginning to weigh on his chest, and to his surprise, he spotted a decomposing mountain goat. Harvey stood there in fear. Harvey realised a blood trail between his feet, turning around to see a snow leopard looking straight back at him, its jaws dripping from the blood of his victim. Harvey's mind raced, but before he even got to think, the big cat had already pounced at his face. Harvey put his arm in front of his face to attempt to save himself. The leopard began to shake Harvey's forearm side to side, flesh tearing and bones breaking. In an effort of defence, Harvey gouged out the leopard's eyes. Immediately, the leopard retreated up the mountain, out of Harvey's view. In deep pain, he wrapped his arm with his spare shirt in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Knowing he didn't have much time left, he began to descend. Harvey's pain started to increase more and more, to the point where it was becoming unbearable. Nightfall began. He started to set up camp again in pure agony, lighting his campfire with one hand. The pain was so bad, Harvey didn't get any sleep in the night. It felt like it was never ending. As the sunrise began, Harvey stepped out to see his arm swollen, knowing this was symptoms of an infection. Despite the pain, he kept on dragging his feet through the deep snow. He felt himself getting lightheaded due to the extreme amount of blood he had lost. He kept on going, swaying side to side, slowly blinking, before he fell to the ground, in and out of consciousness. Harvey began to think about the previous warnings he had gotten from people, but he was still happy with how far he came. Harvey didn't regret anything, and smiled as he took his last breath. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy my kind of content, please consider subscribing for videos every Saturday.